From my problem or my dilemma, I'm going to move to my thesis. I decided that the category of perception, that's category 1, and category 2, importance, would be the best fit for curling. So my thesis, after doing a couple drafts of it, this was what I arrived at for my final thesis. While the Olympic sport of curling, notice how I included the full name of my topic, evokes housework and simplicity to many people, comma, the fact that it requires agility, precision, and strategy, especially when sweeping stones. So the sweeping stones brings me back to my specific topic from my target. Especially when sweeping stones renders it, vocab word, a highly complex and frequently misunderstood game. From there, I realized I needed a bit more evidence, and that even though I had collected a number of facts about the sport, I didn't have enough evidence to support my thesis. I did a little bit more research, and I'm going to show you my first piece of evidence. Notice the arrows here. So thesis, evidence 1. My first piece of evidence was to prove my problem, essentially, which was that people mock curling. People say it isn't a sport, and people compare it to housework and shuffleboard. And so I'm listing these here as objective facts. And while people's opinions, of course, are not facts, these things do happen, and people do say these things about curling. And I found an article about curling. One moment, please. Here's the article about curling. It's from the Washington Post, and the headline is, Olympic Curling Still Struggling to be Taken Seriously. And here's the most important sentence. As Olympic curling nears the end of its 4th day of competition, the sport is still struggling to gain respect. One Sochi-based reporter from the LA Times heard a Russian colleague getting ready to cover the action in the Ice Cube Arena say, "I'm going inside to learn how to sweep that broom real fast so I can make my wife do better in the kitchen." So clearly not even the reporter is taking the sport seriously and is comparing it to housework. So that's my evidence that people do mock the sport. And my reasoning here, here's my reasoning, says this is again about making sense or drawing a conclusion. So whenever you get to the reasoning, think, what is the therefore? Therefore what? And so I wrote, these opinions reveal, that's my strong verb, that curling is misunderstood as a sport and that people don't understand how the game works. Okay, so then that arrow from the reasoning takes me back to the thesis. It relates back to the thesis. And now I'm going to move on to my second piece of evidence, following my arrow down here. Evidence 2, which also happens to be an anecdote. Here's my second piece of evidence. People who play and coach curling explain the challenges and nuances of the game as a whole, as shown in interviews. In other words, personal experience can tell you a lot about the actual sport. And there's an article that I found that has an interview with the Olympic curling coach. And I'm going to show you that interview. And it starts off, here we go, talking about 5 burning questions. And those are the Norwegian curling pants, by the way. Question number 1, why is it good for TV? That doesn't really relate to my work. Burning question number 2, are curlers athletes? That definitely does relate to my work, but I'm going to keep going. How difficult is it to play? And here the coach is explaining that there are various techniques and paths, and that you have to really understand a lot about how the stone moves across the ice in a clockwise or counterclockwise rotation. And he said, he ended here that said, it takes a lifetime to learn all of the different shots that you could possibly throw. So this question with the coach is my evidence, my second piece of evidence. And from that, I come to my reasoning, which is that their personal experience proves, this time I'm using the word proves, the previous time I used the word reveal, that curling does require skill and training. Okay, and so that brings me back to my thesis. One other important thing to mention for my second piece of evidence is that it evokes pathos. So here are the actors happy and crying, and I put the pathos faces there because the people who play curling, I assume, are probably kind of irritated that people don't think their sport is even a sport or that they compare it to housework. So if I were to go more in depth here, what I would do is explain how this is hurtful to them and hurtful to the sport as a whole. So now I go back to my thesis, I follow my reasoning arrow back to my thesis, and I come over to my third piece of evidence. So my first piece of evidence was sort of general opinion and a news article. My second piece of evidence was an interview, and my third piece of evidence, that's my dog coming to join me. My third piece of evidence is a scientific study, and there was actually a journal article published about the complexities of sweeping and how much of a big difference it can make in the placement of the stone at the end. And it explained that complex physics concepts are involved and that people have to make quick guesses. They really have to think on the fly. And that came from, one moment, that came from, dun, 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 an article called The Sports Science of Curling, a Practical Review by John L. Bradley. And here's the abstract, or sort of the overall summary that I found interesting. He says, curling is the only sport in which the trajectory of the projectile, the stone, can be influenced after it has been released by the athlete. And he goes on to talk about stone-ice friction and how it curls and how it's physically demanding, and that the sweeping, the different techniques of sweeping, can have different effects on the stone. And I skimmed through his whole article, and of course I would look through it more in depth before I go to write about it, but overall it does explain the complexities of sweeping. This takes me to my reasoning, my third reasoning, and I said these studies, because he did cite a number of studies in his bibliography, verify, so the word I use here is verify, as opposed to proves or reveals. These studies verify the complexity of the game and show that successful curlers must be able to make complex calculations in their heads about the speed and direction of the stones. So this brings me more specifically to my target, which is sweeping effectively, and I back it up with a research study, which is a pretty solid bit of evidence. From there, I go back to the thesis, follow the arrow, and then I take another arrow off to the side, to the qualifier. The qualifier is what narrows or makes the thesis more precise. So here I said, of course, curling is different from other winter sports, requiring less endurance than skiing and less pressure to perform, especially as compared to figure skating. So in other words, I'm not trying to say that curling is the best sport ever, or the hardest sport ever, or the most difficult sport, but I'm narrowing it down a little bit. The next thing, follow the arrow, the rebuttal. I'm anticipating that someone may disagree with me. Some people may not be persuaded by the evidence, but they should try to curl, in other words, try it yourself before you dismiss it, before disparaging an activity beloved by many. So that might be a little over the top, but it gets the point across. And then this brings me to the conclusion. And here's just a two-sentence conclusion to wrap up my ideas. Of course, I'll expand on this more later. Like many less popular sports, curling has been ridiculed by many people, and even by the media. However, and this is where a somewhat of a restatement of my thesis comes in, however, the skill, training, and strategy required should cause people to reconsider the sport and respect those who excel at it. And that is the end. So here is the whole poster for you to see. And you may remember that my hook is not yet complete, which is fine because I'm going to come back to that later after I write the whole essay. So here it is. Notice all the arrows. And the next step is going to be to work through the arrows and to expand on each part either verbally or in written form. But this has set us up well for organization and for understanding the different parts of the argument and for making sure that they are all there. Enjoy the rest of your snow day.